Vi befinner oss på Engelsbergs bruk och 2023 års Engelsbergsseminarium som har temat Leadership and Statecraft. I det pass vi nu ska få se koncentrerar sig inledarna just på statskonsten. Vad kännetecknar verklig statskonst? Vad behöver en ledare kunna för att utöva den?
We started with some bad poetry yesterday, and we'll start with some better poetry today. This time it's no less a person than T.S. Eliot, who wrote the lines, "Where is the wisdom that was lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge that was lost in information?" And that's a very fitting introduction to Iskander, Rehman, who's going to talk on the topic of information overload.
So when I was 5 years old, my grandparents took me to Hamleys. Now, for those in the room who weren't raised in the UK, Hamleys is the largest toy shop in the world, a London landmark which stretches over 7 floors and sprawls over 54,000 square feet. I remember Mini-Me entering its packed, cavernous halls in a state of utter dazed bewilderment, nervously clutching my grandmother's hand as she instructed me to choose one present amidst all the toys on display for my birthday. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, what a lucky, privileged little boy to be taken to such a wonderful place and spoilt rotten by doting grandparents, to be presented with such an amazing array of things to choose from. Surely this must have been one of the happiest moments in 5-year-old Iskander's life. Well, instead, somewhat puzzlingly, some subtle changes in my general demeanor began to slowly unfold. My palms grew sweaty, my breathing accelerated, my initial elation soon curdled into some deeper form of existential angst. How could I possibly make a decision to choose just one toy in the midst of such mind-numbing abundance? What if I missed or overlooked something as I was wandering an aisle or riding one of those awe-inspiringly massive escalators? What if I made the wrong choice because that man in the creepy clown suit in the corner distracted me? What if I got lost amidst the bouncy ball or G.I. Joe sections? Even worse, what if I lost control of my bladder and couldn't find the toilets in there? God, wouldn't that be embarrassing, especially in front of all these hundreds of other children? My grandparents kept on saying they wanted to go home for lunch in less than 15 minutes. Didn't they realize that wasn't nearly enough time? There were thousands of items here to examine, to categorize, to evaluate, to meticulously compare and contrast. The Teenage Ninja Turtle section alone appeared to span an entire corridor. In short, it was all too much for my 5-year-old brain. It was too overwhelming. So instead I broke down crying and we had to leave. Later that day, my grandparents took me to another much smaller toy shop where I rapidly made my pick. So why did I start by sharing this moderately embarrassing memory? What does it tell us apart from the fact perhaps that I could obviously be quite an annoying boy? Well, I think it points on a micro level to some of the paradoxical decisional quandaries or cognitive dilemmas that come from living in our period of unparalleled plenty. We live in an era of abundance and distraction, of shrinking attention spans and content shock, and of seemingly endless quantity over elusively finite quality. Since the advent of the internet, we have never had access to so much information, and yet data shows that we are collectively less well-read, often collectively less well-informed, more intellectually febrile, fragmented and jittery. We're all familiar with the depressing statistics. Our hyper-connected brains are being subtly rewired by those synthetic appendages that are our smartphones, which Americans now touch on average 2,000 times a day. Even as our digital databases continue to massively expand, our attention spans continue to shrink. We all collectively struggle to collect, classify, categorize, and process the ever-growing mounds of information at our disposal. What should that small clump of overly stimulated grey matter that lies between our ears privilege or prioritize during our limited time on this little blue ball we call Earth? What should we merely skim or peruse, or what should we take the time to read in depth? Do I really need to read all of Proust to be a truly educated individual, as I repeatedly and vainly remind myself at the onset of each summer holiday? And indeed, each year, come September, I silently castigate myself. But then I'm reminded so do most of us, and not just nowadays either. Writing in a state of haughty and cranky isolation from his cottage in mid-19th century Massachusetts, Henry David Thoreau lamented the fact that he had never got round to reading Plato, writing, "Shall I hear the name of Plato and never read his book, as if Plato were my townsman and I never saw him, my next neighbor and I never heard him speak or attended to the wisdom of his words? But how actually is it? His dialogues, which contain what was immortal in him, lie on the next shelf, and yet I never read him. And then here comes the self-flagellation part. He adds, we are underbred and low-lived and illiterate. We are a race of runts, and soar but little higher in our intellectual flights than the column of the daily paper. So yes, as always, Foro sounds fun, even though one can relate all too well, I think, with that nagging sense of guilt. And when it comes to history, which history should we come to really master and why? After all, by its very nature, history keeps on expanding, not only in its temporal scope as we march through time, but also historiographically through the accumulated sedimentation of different generations of historical or philological analysis, and even geographically, as we now thankfully become much more aware of alternative historical traditions outside the bounds of the so-called West. Should an American ruthlessly prioritize the history of the American Revolution over that of antiquity? Conversely, can one truly understand the history of the American Revolution and the thought processes of the Founding Fathers without delving into the writings of Sallust, Livy, Plutarch, and Cicero? And perhaps more importantly, how do these issues of information management and cognitive overload affect gatherers of intelligence or makers of policy in their everyday functions? Now, in the limited time I've left, I thought I would focus very briefly on two core themes. The first being that our latent anxieties about our ability to manage informational abundance and complexity are, in fact, not that new. And although they may currently appear exacerbated by the sheer velocity of ongoing technological advances, they were particularly prevalent during the so-called information explosion of the early modern era. And then finally, I will argue that one should view the historian's endeavor not only in terms of its rich empirical content as a gigantic warehouse, if you will, of instructive parallels for policymakers, although that can certainly be one of its functions, but rather in terms of the actual process involved. The process of historical inquiry itself provides a form of calisthenics of the mind, one which strengthens its capability to process information, boosts its ability to detect patterns amid tangled skeins of concurrent events, and more generally helps it rise above the crushing mass of everyday phenomena. In so doing, it greatly enhances what the ancients would have termed prudence, or what we would now perhaps refer to as either intuitive intelligence or the capacity for good judgment. Now, why is the early modern period particularly interesting for scholars of information management and policymaking? Well, first and foremost, because the period stretching from the late Renaissance to the early Baroque era was one of enormous political, intellectual, and diplomatic upheaval. The increased sophistication of the early modern state, its growing centralization, the heightened intricacy of its bureaucratic apparatus, complete with its teetering mounds of paperwork and endless reams of epistolary exchanges, all of these developments required chronically overworked rulers to find safe and reliable ways of delegating their authority, administering their newly sprawling domains, and implementing their increasingly far-reaching reforms. Institutionally, this led both to the mushrooming across Europe of small governing councils, composed of tight cadres of ministers and royal councillors, and to the rise of the figure of the secretary, the discreet and dedicated public servant who acted at the heart of the sprawling new letterocracy, which had extended its dry tendrils across the chancelleries, ministries, and embassies of the continent. Paperwork had become the demon of early modern statecraft. Kings, popes, and doges all found themselves gasping for air under a veritable deluge of memorandums and correspondence. Philip II of Spain was frequently driven to despair by what he called these devils my papers, with up to 16,000 separate petitions being sent to his desk over the course of a single year. Similarly, Richelieu, behind his wintry and steely exterior, was in fact often a neurotic mess, drowning in work and suffering from migraines. And within this densely saturated information environment, the role of the newly empowered secretary, ambassador, or counselor was not only to filter, distill, and interpret these incoming torrents of data, but also to provide clear and actionable guidance to their overwhelmed rulers. This required, noted many writers and commentators at the time, a distinct set of skills: clarity of style and expression, the ability to be detail-oriented while not losing sight of the big picture, and the capacity to combine careful reflection with prompt decisiveness. Many of you are probably familiar with Winston Churchill's famous 1940 memorandum urging greater brevity and clarity in government communications, touting the virtues of short, crisp paragraphs and calling for an end to bloated, unnecessary verbiage. Well, many 16th and 17th century writers, from the Spaniard Baltasar Gracian to the Florentine Guicciardini, in fact argued very much along similar lines, and even more forcefully. With the advent of the printing press and the rediscovery of long-lost works from antiquity, historically inclined councillors and statesmen were now faced with a daunting new problem, that of overwhelmingly abundant source material. Now, some of this cognitive burden was offloaded in the form of florilegieux, compendia, and encyclopedias. This was also the era when the footnote was invented. And people like Samuel Johnson or Francis Bacon spoke of the necessity of adopting new, more differentiated forms of reading strategies to cope with this ever-growing influx of content, with Francis Bacon famously writing that, I quote, some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Some books are to be read only in parts, others to be read but not curiously, and some few to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. Satirists from La Bruyère to Jonathan Swift fiercely lampooned those among their contemporaries who never actually read the great works in full, but rather bought and skimmed ready-made summaries of the 17th century equivalent, let's say, to Fukuyama's End of History, and then made a great show of quoting select excerpts at dinner parties, with Jonathan Swift noting that, after all, I quote, "To enter the palace of learning at the Great Gate requires an expense of time and forms. Therefore, men of much haste and little ceremony are content to get in by the back door." History was still considered the wet nurse of prudence and its study to be the essential prerequisite for sound statecraft, but writers started to warn of its potential ability by its sheer bloated mass to confound, daze, and overwhelm. How much is the sight of a man's mind distracted by experience and history, warned Bacon. When it came to the study of the rise and fall of great nations, it was not good, he said, to look too long upon these turning wheels of vicissitude, lest we become giddy. To be overly fascinated by history, Philip Sidney argued in his influential defense of poesy, was to be overly captivated to the truth of a foolish world, mired in grubby, unedifying sequences of events rather than engaging in more elevated forms of philosophical or poetical reflection. To which thinkers could and did respond that it was not so much the dull cataloguing of events themselves that mattered, but rather how one chose to make sense of them. Central to the process of historical inquiry is the notion of what early modern thinkers termed discernment, a word which actually only first began entering common usage in the late 1500s. What does discernment mean precisely? A modern dictionary definition might say keenness of intellectual perception, insight, acuteness of judgment. More prosaically, one might simply say it refers to the ability to engage in critical thinking. Its etymology, though, derives from the Latin discernere, which means to separate, to divide, or more accurately, to sift apart. Thus writes Montaigne in his essays, "A true student of history should pass everything through a sieve, and lodge nothing in his head on mere authority or trust." Famously, he wrote that it was better to have a well-made rather than a well-filled head. In short, what was important was not so much to cram one's head full of dates and dynasties, but to take the time to understand the how and the why of things. Let a student be taught not so much the histories as how to judge them. That, in my opinion, he adds, is of all matters the one to which we apply our minds in the richest degree. And it's this particular aspect of the cognitive process inherent to historical examination that I think is the most relevant when it comes to our era. The ability to engage in what the great Greek historian Polybus, who was hugely influential in the early modern era, termed the study of the interweaving of events, i.e. the ability to scry the riotous flow of world affairs with the hope of spotting, amid its eddying worlds, underlying currents of cause and effect. And this intuitive sifting and sorting ability, only gradually accreted over years of study, allows one to identify chains of causation more rapidly and fluidly, to more easily draw attention to the interconnections between theatres, actions, and events, and to more seamlessly analyze events horizontally as well as vertically. Scientifically speaking, experts on cognition might refer to this as the ability to engage in associative processes across multiple planes at the same time. And indeed, neuroscience has shown that the brain region that is consistently engaged in the kind of analogical or relational reasoning we're talking about is the left frontal lobe, the same part of the brain which has long been postulated to play a key role in creative innovation. And it's perhaps for all of these reasons that the great Harvard historian John Clive once openly wondered whether, I quote, "Historians, especially those dealing with abstract entities like groups and classes and movements, have to possess a special metaphorical capacity, a plastic or tactile imagination that can detect shapes or configurations where others less gifted see only jumble and confusion." And Isaiah Berlin, in his masterful essay on political judgment that I really recommend everyone in this room to read, evokes something very similar, albeit with his characteristic iridescent eloquence, talking of a skill which entails, above all, a capacity for integrating a vast amalgam of constantly changing, multicolored, evanescent, perpetually overlapping data, too many, too swift, too intermingled to be caught and pinned down like so many individual butterflies, an acute sense of what fits with what springs from what leads to what, and so on and so forth. In short, and I'll stop here because otherwise I will have my self-inflicted information overload on you all, we should perhaps be somewhat more optimistic as to the prospects of our chosen field. Yes, history departments may be closing, and yes, tenured job prospects may be dwindling, but somewhat paradoxically, in our information-drenched, distraction-filled, and data-drowned world, the historian's hard-earned mental navigational skills may actually prove to be among those most useful for harried and cognitively overwhelmed policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we say that the secret of great leaders is that they master this art of discernment, reducing complicated things to the most important thing to do?
Yes, I think that once again falls under the register of that elusive quality that one refers to as political judgment, or what perhaps going back to Aristotle and Cicero they would have termed prudence, practical wisdom, which refers to the ability to accurately judge the contingent rather than more permanent forms of knowledge. And yes, it is that rare quality to be able to both sift through large amounts of often conflicting information and then act promptly and decisively.
Thank you, Iskander, very much.
Thank you.
So I welcome Philip Zelikow to the stage to talk about the craft aspect of statecraft. You have a small paper with you. That's promising. Thank you.
Small papers for small minds. On July 27th, 1916, the Kaiser of Imperial Germany had a very important conversation with the Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. The discussion was about how Germany could end the war. World War I at that point had been going on for 2 years. All the military plans had failed. 1916 was the worst year yet. This was the year of Verdun, the year of the Somme. The Somme offensive, in fact, had been underway for about 4 weeks and was still going on when Bethmann and the Kaiser had their talk. Germany was desperate to end the war. There are 2 ways in which the German government thought it could end the war. One way was to find a way to negotiate peace, and Bethmann had concluded that the only way to get a peace going was to secretly ask the American President Woodrow Wilson to call a conference and mediate an end. So there was the peace track. The alternative track, which some of the military leaders of Germany were advocating so earnestly, was to escalate the U-boat war in the hope that that would then be the grand panacea that could take the place of the ground offensives that had already been failing so bloodily. The conversation then between the Kaiser and Bethmann was about which road to choose. Bethmann argued we should choose the peace road, we should go to Wilson. He explained to the Kaiser, if we go to Wilson, you have to understand that means we'll have to give up, Wilson will surely insist that we'll have to give up Belgium as a condition for his mediation and make it clear that, you know, this is going to be what they would call at the time a peace of understanding. Basically a peace that would go back to something like the 1914 status quo. The Kaiser agreed, July 27th, 1916, and authorized Bethmann to go forward, which he then did in about the next week, drafting a very secret letter to President Wilson that kicked off the process. The Kaiser remained personally, directly backing Bethmann on the peace road for the next 5.5 months. From July 27, 1916 until January 9th, 1917. And he even allowed Bethmann to continue to try one last play on January 31st, 1917. German government, desperate to end the war, has opened the peace road all in secret. The French government was desperate to end the war. In another extremely secret conversation, the president of France, Rehman, had a private meeting with the King of England in the most confidential channel he could possibly devise, just the two men, the President and the King, meeting in France while the King was visiting the front. Poincaré explained, we need to bring the war to an end. The only way that we can see to bring the war to an end is Wilson has to make the move. We can't volunteer it publicly. Wilson has to do it. When Wilson does it, and he expected Wilson to make this move in October, we have to then be ready with our terms to go forward to end the war. He said, my people do not understand how bad the situation is. And he also pointed, as they all knew, to the fact that they believed Russian collapse was coming soon, which was an accurate prediction. Russian collapse would come in the early part of the next year. So, by the way, that conversation with the King was, of course, promptly reported back to the British government. The report was circulated very secretly in the British cabinet later that same month. The British government had been deliberating whether to end the war for some time, partly because of their sense that there were no further military options, but the British government more than any other realized what was the most secret thing on the entire Allied side, which was that Britain was running out of the money to sustain the war at all. This was the great secret. That realization had dawned on the British Treasury during the winter, actually, of 1915-16. They were running out of the dollars to maintain the war. They could just see the dollars running out. They were, by late 1916, dollars and the purchases from America were funding 40% of the Allied war effort, an amount and scale of expenditure greater than the entire war expenditure of France. The dollars would run out absolutely, not dwindle, absolutely out by early 1917. They were already using up all their gold bullion and dollar-denominated securities as collateral to extend their dollar purchases all through 1916, and they could palpably measure when it would all run out. So with that secret in mind, the British government had actually considered petitioning Wilson to start his mediation in May. They had come so close to deciding to do this, they had actually drafted the cable to Wilson that was discussed at a cabinet meeting at the end of May, and then decided not to do it because Wilson gave an unfortunate speech that kicked the pins out from under the possibility of the move. The fundamental problem for the British government is Wilson had to make the move because theirs was a coalition government, and the Tories in the coalition would not agree to go along with a peace move. All right, so you see the situation. German government, French government, British government, all waiting for Wilson. Wilson, of course, absolutely eager to do this and play this role. We have this image of Woodrow Wilson as this messianic, woolly-headed idealist. In fact, his view of the war was quite realistic and practical and far-sighted strategically. He thought the causes of the war are obscure and no one in my country understands them and are effectively irrelevant now. The only possible solution to the war has to be what he called, actually borrowing from a column he liked in the New Republic, a peace without victory, because he believed correctly that if the war continued to a bitter conclusion, the resentments that would be engendered by that conclusion would only make another war that much more likely very soon thereafter. So he thought that the war had to be brought to an end somehow one way or another, and he dreaded the possibility that if it continued, America might be dragged into it, which is something he was determined he would try to avert. So you see, all the stars were in alignment to end the war 2 years in. The major governments secretly wanted to end it. They all looked to Wilson to provide the means to do it. Wilson was anxious to play this role and had the far-sighted vision of what needed to be done. Why didn't it happen? Indeed, the worst case occurred in which not only did the war not end, the war actually expanded and widened, using then American funds to take the place of the bankrupt British Treasury. It didn't happen not because leaders did not know what to do. It was because Woodrow Wilson in particular did not know how to do it. He did not know how to simply conduct the diplomacy to arrange a peace conference and successfully manage the mediation. That wasn't in his skill set. So in a way, he was a realistic visionary at the strategic level about the general course that should be followed, quite rightly, but just simply didn't know how to organize a peace conference and fumbled in a variety of ways until the Germans, giving up on him, partly because they were misled by things that Wilson's aide, Edward House, was telling them, which one can only discover by comparing the German and American files. The whole thing then foundered at the end of January 1917 and beginning of February 1917 with the most tragic possible results. Now, I tell you this story because it illustrates, I regard this, by the way, as the turning point of the First World War, which was not on the battlefield. The fact that the war didn't end and instead America entered it, I regard as the turning point of the war. And the turning point of the war actually occurred not because statesmen did not know what they should do, it was because statesmen, in particular the President of the United States, did not know how to do it. So let me come back then for a moment to the general theme of the conference. The general theme is leadership and statecraft. So what is leadership? I'll just define it for you very simply. Leadership is choosing what to do and guiding people in how to do it. This is my definition of leadership at all levels. Choosing what, the captain who sets the compass bearing and then guides the sailors in how to sail the craft. That's leadership. If you impart confident knowledge of how to do things, that's often what inspires people to be able to do them. So what to do and how to do it. What then is statecraft? The other great theme of the conference. Statecraft is the same thing as applied in international politics. But what's distinctive about statecraft from leadership is statecraft in particular, by the word itself, emphasizes the second dimension, the how to do it dimension, because it's clear that statecraft is not simply about expressing a vision. The craft in statecraft is about doing it. It's about performance. That's what converts vision into craft. That's what creates statecraft. The knowledge of how to do it is especially key when we think about the qualities of statecraft. And it is obscure. It is obscure. The point is easily carried over to the present day, and we see it everywhere around us. Take, for example, the situation that preoccupies Swedes at the moment. Sweden wants to go into NATO. The American government gets the information. Sweden would like to be in NATO. What to do? Should America say yes to the Swedish desire? Well, of course. Easy question. All right, how to do it? How to get Sweden into NATO with this Turkish problem? How to solve the Turkish problem? Now that is statecraft. And then when you get into the details of that problem, it's actually rather intricate and difficult, and hardly anyone understands the negotiations that are going on right now with Turkey, especially between the United States and Turkey. We don't understand it. Because we don't understand it, we don't study it, and we don't teach it. I just finished a national report, part of a group of 34 scientists, doctors, others, on lessons from the COVID crisis. I was asked to help lead an investigative group, and we published our report in April in the United States. And when you look at the COVID crisis, actually, the what to do part is obvious. Well, like, for example, should we have a global vaccine? Yes. Well, how to do the global vaccine? How to develop it in record time and distribute billions of doses of vaccines across the world. Now that's hard. That's statecraft. It was not done terribly well, frankly, by the governments. There was an actually extraordinary international improvisation called COVAX that distributed 2 billion vaccine doses and probably saved at least 1 million lives, maybe many more, a program that hardly anyone in the world understands, and they have no idea how it was invented or who invented it or who designed it. You could call that a miracle of statecraft, but of course no one understands anything about it. You could then take, for example, the Ukraine war right now. I'm currently engaged in...
2 minutes, don't go too deep into the Ukraine war.
I won't. I published a foreign affairs essay with Larry Summers and Bob Zelikow yesterday for people who want to read more than I can cover in 2 minutes. The only point I wanted to make about it is that the center of gravity in the war is Ukraine's staying power and ability to resist Russia's war of attrition and ruin. That actually will turn principally on political and economic measures, not the effort on the battlefield. That requires, I think, an effort to tap the Russian assets. At the political level, that have been frozen, $300 billion worth. At the political level, it seems obvious that, of course, the Russians should pay for the consequences of their war. Yet at the political level, having said this from people like von der Leyen, then their staff tell them, well, too hard. We don't know how to do it. To this day, to this moment, that is why hundreds of billions of dollars potentially able to guarantee Ukraine's staying power and actually rehabilitate and revitalize the entire region have not yet been tapped. So simply the point for all of you is, if you think about leadership in statecraft, notice that second dimension, notice how little it is understood, how little it is studied, and how little it is taught.
Philip, I have a question. Philip, was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union an illustration of someone knowing the how to do it dimension of world affairs?
Yes, actually it was. I've written a couple of books on this subject, and Andreas Röder, who is here, has done outstanding scholarship on this as well. But actually the interesting thing about it is we know brilliant statecraft happened here somehow, but we actually don't know what it was. And so in my country, for instance, a common answer is, well, Bush didn't gloat when the Berlin Wall came down, and that made Gorbachev feel better, and so we all lived happily ever after. When you get into the details of it, it has to do with the engineering of the way Germany unified, the engineering of how you organize the international negotiations for doing this, and there was and the pace at which these designs were put in place and then moved and choreographed, engineered by people like Helmut Kohl and Jim Baker. But it's a level of statecraft and policy engineering that, again, I think is much admired in the abstract and hardly at all understood in detail.
Thank you very much for this elegant presentation. So we've been talking about information overload, statecraft as the craft of how to do it, and now we're going to address a third aspect, understanding your opponent's ideas and moves. Where is Elisabeth? There you are, thank you. It's not only how you do it, but understanding what the other one is trying to do. Welcome.
That's exactly the case, and you just mentioned Turkey. How do we get Turkey to do what we want them to do? And that is absolutely fundamental, not just with regards to Turkey, but with every country, right? And that is deterrence and compellence, boring subjects, I think, perceived as boring subjects until recently, no longer the case. But I was just scanning in the room. I don't think there's anybody here from the Bundeswehr, so I'll tell you what happened at a conference a few years ago before the Ukraine war, I hasten to add. There is something called the Land Warfare Conference, which is for army leaders from every European army and the US Army, and there is always a panel of well, there are a number of panels, but there's always a panel of army chiefs, and they speak in a very learned way and with a lot of jargon about issues of the day. And I remember a few years ago, the Dutch army chief who was on the panel that year, it was his turn to speak, and so he stood up and said, well, I understand we don't have much time, so I won't be able to tell you a joke, so I won't talk about the Bundeswehr. But the point is that deterrence doesn't just involve using our armed forces or threatening to use our armed forces. And in fact, deterrence and compellence, which is something that I think is, not just I think, it is equally important. It is how we motivate countries to do the thing we want them to do, not just motivate them to do the things we don't want them to do. So how do we do that? Well, it's not about what we do, but about how they perceive what we want them to do. And that brings us to the importance of psychology, in understanding the other side. So how do we understand, for example, what motivates Erdogan? How do we understand what motivates Putin, Xi Jinping, or any foreign leader? If we don't understand that, the deterrence and compellence measures we use will be of no effect, because the people that we are trying to convince to do A, B, or C may not be motivated at all by what we offer. And I was reminded of, in this context, of something that a certain Colonel Joachim Wiegand told me when I wrote my book about the Stasi. He was in charge of the Stasi's church division, which recruited pastors to spy on the entirety of East German Christianity. And so how do you recruit pastors to do that sort of thing? It's actually quite tricky. And you can't just go to any old pastor and say, well, would you like to work for us? Because most pastors would not be particularly open to that proposition. And so the Stasi, like any intelligence agency worth its grain of salt, documented, studied the potential recruits they might like to approach. And this went on for a long time. And Joachim Wiegand told me, so you have to understand what motivates this guy, what is he about, what are his weaknesses. And that is true not just for intelligence recruitment, but for deterrence and compellence equally. Because if we don't understand what motivates Erdogan, if we don't understand what motivates Putin or any other leaders, what we present as a very powerful tool of deterrence, for example, the threat of sanctions, the threat of military action, it may not faze them. And this is, I think, increasingly important, because the behavior of leaders today is so different from even 30 years ago, when we could assume that, the foreign leaders we as the West deal with, they are mostly on a journey towards becoming like us, so we won't need to threaten them very much at all. Well, that ain't the case anymore. And so we need to understand what motivates them in order to help move them in the direction that we consider helpful and towards the goals that we are trying to achieve. And actually, if I can ask why, if anybody has any points or any thoughts on where we went wrong with the deterrent sanction, what we thought were deterrent sanctions against Russia before the war, so to deter the prospective invasion of Ukraine, where did we go wrong? This is not a university class. It's just a question for anybody who has any thoughts on that.
I'll say collectively, we, not everyone, assumed that the Russian leadership cared about the same things we do.
True. And we also assumed that the Russian leadership cared about the well-being and prosperity of the Russian people. So we thought that if we threatened Putin with sanctions against Russia, then he will say, oh, that wouldn't be very good for Russia. I better not do what I'd like to do. Well, what if he doesn't care about the prosperity and well-being of the general Russian public? What if Xi Jinping doesn't care about the general well-being and prosperity of the Chinese, of the population of China? Or what if the current Iranian leadership, religious and secular, doesn't care about the well-being and prosperity of the people of Iran? What if they mostly care about something completely different that can be their vision of where they want to take their country, which may be at odds of where we think it would be helpful for that country to go? What if they care mostly about their retention and expansion of power, their personal power? That puts them in a very different mindset when it comes to the sort of punitive measure, or indeed encouraging measures that we send their way. And I was reminded of the importance of understanding how other people think. The other day I thought back to a number of years ago in a previous life. I happened to be in Karachi, and on this day, this very late night actually, I was in the outskirts of Karachi with a very flamboyant fashion designer who he displays his hedonism day and night. But anyway, he had taken me to meet a number of people who are involved in the Karachi Literary Festival, and we had a lovely conversation about books and culture and so forth. And this conversation ended around 1 a.m. And then, so he was going to take me back to my hotel, and then we got to his car, and he realized that, oops, he locked the key in the car. There we stood in the outskirts of Karachi. I had no idea where we were. And so we stood there outside the car, and he said, I have no idea how to get into my car. And from various buildings in this, around this parking area where we were standing, emerged various men of various ages, dressed in very traditional Muslim garb and with long beards and so forth. And I thought, ooh, this is not going to end well. My hedonist fashion designer friend and these men, it's not going to end well, and I have no idea where I am. But what happened was that these men, in the Muslim garb and long beards and so forth, proceeded to helping him get into his car. And he got into his car, and we drove back to the hotel. And that reminded me of the importance of preconceived notions, which is what we have about foreign leaders. We think we know how... and foreign regimes, because we often think of them as collectives. If we do this, Russia will respond. Well, Russia is a collection of people with completely different motivations. China, the Chinese leadership, is a collection of people with completely different personal preferences, motivations, desires, weaknesses. Just like these men there in Karachi, who reacted in a way that I had not predicted, because I didn't understand their personal circumstances. And I viewed them as simply as representatives of a group. And that was a mistake. And that is a mistake I think we should avoid making with in our dealings with foreign countries. And Putin's motivations, what are they? I know that intelligence agencies carry out psychological assessments, but I do know that those psychological assessments don't translate into policy, because if they had translated into policy, we would have seen, for example, sanctions targeting his girlfriend and those 2 children in Switzerland early on. That may be his weak spot, not the strength of the Russian economy. And what about Xi Jinping? What are his weak points? It could be his daughter, who very much likes living in America. It could be revoking or threatening to revoke her visa. And by the way, it's nobody's human right to get a visa to the United States or any other country. That's a tool we can use. I see I have 1 minute left, Ulf, so I'll just say this is true for leaders of all ages. And I was reminded the other day of, I shouldn't say a lovely scene, an interesting scene in Heinz Guderian's memoirs. Heinz Guderian, the father of tank warfare, he, in his memoirs about World War II, he writes, it's full of episodes. I recommend this book, and it actually is accessible even to those of us who are not tank warfare experts. But anyway, he writes about a visit by Hitler to the Eastern Front at the late stage in the war, and on that day, the canteen was serving pea soup with pieces of meat in it. That's how you serve pea soup. And so the question was, since Hitler was a vegetarian, what to do about this. Would he eat this soup? And it's tiny pieces of meat in pea soup. So did he eat the soup?
What?
Did he eat the soup, do you think?
No.
No, he didn't. He ate an apple. And that is, I think, also...
That's statecraft, is it?
If we had understood that
Yeah.
care, this extreme care for animals motivates Hitler, a man who obviously had no care for any other living creatures, I think that would have helped us design better deterrence and compellence, possibly, of Hitler over.
And today there's some controversy against the saying we must not humiliate Putin. I think it's Macron who has said this, and that has been ridiculed. But from what you are saying, there's some sense in this, because if you understand his motivations, maybe you're better prepared not to humiliate him.
I don't think it's about humiliating. It's about sending a personalized message about the personal harm that a foreign leader may stand to suffer. And by the way, if that foreign leader totally identifies himself with his country, or her country for that matter, then you can threaten or signal that you will impose general sanctions against that country. But I think through the history of mankind, most leaders have shown themselves to love themselves more than they love their countries.
But could the message be, we understand what drives you, but we think this is wrong, and we're going to prove that you are wrong? Is that a way of treating your opponent?
No, we are going to make it harmful for you personally to pursue the path that you're suggesting you'd like to pursue.
An excellent introduction to John Bew. Thank you. Wonderful session where every speaker links into the next one.
Perfect. Thank you, Ulf. I have only one slide with much wisdom, but can I ask you to hold it for a moment and go back to the back screen? So that there's a moment of reveal, which is important in my speech. So today my remarks are on the subject of statecraft, past, present, and future. And I don't want to spend all my time defining what statecraft is or get too deep into academic theology, but I should probably start with a working definition. Statecraft is called different things in different languages, and indeed, of course, as Iskander was saying, it means different things in different eras. In French, it is often called raison d'etat, a reason of state, a term which became popularized in the early modern period, but was sometimes juxtaposed awkwardly with Enlightenment ideas. In Germany, it is sometimes, somewhat misleadingly, called Realpolitik, a more austere credo that urges people to adapt to the harsh realities of power politics. And in the English language, statecraft is sometimes used interchangeably with the idea of the national interest or the practice of high politics, usually, although not exclusively, in foreign policy or national security, rather than the general din of democratic politics, parliaments, elections, policy making more broadly in the round. So here the emphasis, to go back to what Phil Zelikow was saying, is on the craft part of statecraft, seen in the professionalization of diplomacy, intelligence, and the military, a departure from the old days, certainly in the English context, when the aristocracy, those with the means to engage in such activities, used to go bumbling around the globe like well-educated pirates. Now, in my own definition, statecraft is a little less austere than the German tradition, and perhaps a little less self-consciously professionalized than the English language version. It sits somewhere in between, trying to strike a balance between wily self-awareness and burning fury at the hypocrisy or stupidity of others. It creates, crucially, or it contains a creative as well as a critical impulse. It is more than a cult of the national interest. It must build outward and upward to grasp the future rather than simply refine and adapt to the circumstances in which it is practiced. It must be optimistic in spirit, if skeptical in approach. It is an art and not a science. And it is also, crucially, and this is where I slightly depart from Phil's definition, it is as much about the internal coherence and functioning of the state. Think back to the Federalist Papers, think back to Machiavelli, about the state's internal mechanics as well as great matters of international diplomacy overseas. And modern statecraft must not only adapt to the realities of democratic life, but it should seek to harness and deploy them in the interests of the state. But rather than giving you a history today, I want to do something new, or at least something that I have not done before, which is to distill rather than define, and to do so in my own words, so though you will recognize that many of the things I say are familiar in classical texts and are perhaps being subliminally placed in my soul by the politicians I have worked with, perhaps less by others, and I'll come to that in a moment. First of all, and this is new for me, I want to begin to synthesize some of the observations that I have made from an academic career, studying statecraft, particularly as a biographer, which I think is a good route to understanding statecraft, with the experience of now working for 4 years in government, and to come to a sense of how those two worlds meld together. Now, the mistake that academics make who go into government, sometimes the mistake they sometimes make is to assume they are bringing some sort of pure form of knowledge to be opened carefully at the cabinet room and laid out in front of the toothless scoundrels and Philistines crowded around the table. And to my mind, there's nothing more absurd, by the way, the idea there should be an official historian sitting sort of eunuch-like beside the king and offering great wisdom. All history is political in one way or another. But the worlds of study and practice can be mutually illuminating and supporting. Second, I want to outline, therefore, in the rest of my remarks, what I regard as the essential components of statecraft, or more precisely, the components of what, from both historical study and some lived experience, are the essential preconditions of what I would regard as good statecraft. And here is my reveal, if we can have our slide. My remarks should not be treated, of course, with biblical authority, but I seem to have stumbled upon 10 commandments. So I will go as far as these 10 commandments and go briefly through each. They come, I should also say, with a sense of hierarchy, and I hope a sense of a logical progression between them. The first component of statecraft, or good statecraft in my view, is what a reasonably developed sense of what has come before. This is where, of course, the historian is rather scratching, patting oneself on the back for the types of skills they can bring to government. Frank Gavin, our colleague who's here today, calls this a historical sensibility. Historical sensibility is an essential component of statecraft. Now, in its purest form, it is reflected in Machiavelli's view that one must understand the classical world, and of course its great historians, to navigate the early modern world. But one need not be a practitioner or an expert in history to achieve this. But one must have the ability to interrogate assumptions, also lazy assumptions, about how we got to this point. And one must have a sense, crucially, of what others think about what has happened in the immediate and medium-term past as well. These narratives and these stories have considerable political force in a way that does not necessarily depend on the veracity or truth of those stories. History and analogy is the language of government in almost every single policy area. It is therefore the starting book of any good copybook of statecraft to have that sense of historical sensibility and presence. Second, and this is why I hope these follow logically from this, and it flows naturally from the first, a fulsome appreciation of the parameters in which you operate, I think, is the second precondition to good statecraft. The parameters can be the system in which you operate. How does it work? Where do you sit within it? What levers can be pulled? In what ear or whose ear must you whisper? Perhaps when the civil servant walks out of the room, or just a moment, Prime Minister. There's one thing I haven't talked to you about yet, shut the door. It is obvious that life is easier at the apex of your system, or that you have more agency, or that you can wait your moment. It is also true that longevity in government gives you more opportunity to learn how to exert your influence and to learn your trade on the job. And the closer you get to the throne, I would suggest, the easier it is for you to exercise influence and power through good manners, kind words, and patience. In a more precarious position, it might be more wise, alternatively, to scratch the occasional pair of eyes out, or to be noisy or difficult to be heard. And there's no virtue in one form or the other. It depends on where you sit in the system. And then far more important than those parameters of your internal system are the parameters beyond your system. And this is where foreign policy comes in. People spend too long, I think, looking within or working out which metric or self-assessment process is most important when the world around them changes more swiftly than that.
John, you've done 2 components and have 8 left. I'm a little worried about the timekeeping.
I'm okay, don't worry. These will go very quickly. Edmund Burke said circumstances are the condition of defining condition of any political scenario, and so the questions you must ask yourself are: how much domestic room for manoeuvre do you have? How firmly do you have your hands on the reins of power? And what appetite do you have for risk? And that, of course, applies to international politics. There are the obvious metrics of power: the size of the economy, the proportion of GDP, the size of your army. These are the hierarchies, the organizations in which you work, and the organizations that do work or don't work. And appreciation of these objective realities is the baseline for any form of successful statecraft. And I will go faster than that. How long do I have, Ulf? Remaining?
We have some 5 minutes left.
Oh, I'll easily do that. Next, a theory of change. The reason to know your history and to establish the parameters in which you operate is not to succumb meekly to them. Otherwise, statecraft would only be about mowing the lawn and tending the plants. So therefore, as the next evolutionary step in statecraft, successful statecraft also requires a theory of change. Now, those theories of change have to be reassessed and re-examined in government. The respect the sea, your mother may have told you, but also crucially for statecraft, you have to find a way of swimming in the sea or riding the waves in the sea as well. I have been in periods of government when we have felt completely stuck in a box and unable to move left or right, only to burst free by serendipity, accident, or occasionally acumen. And wisdom and opportunism as well. I have seen Leninist approaches to change in government, without naming names, that have got very far, very quick, using the tools of the vanguard to engineer a jolt in historical development. Yet I'd also reflect that some forms of change can run out of momentum or left screaming at the moon or raging against the machine. So sometimes it is better to redefine the existing lexicon, win over a wider grouping by speaking their language and showing that you are more attuned to their concerns. And of course, again, the same goes to foreign policy. Good statecraft means that you can exert an influence that is outsized to your size by traditional metrics, that is not simply dependent on those objective realities that can go beyond them. Fourth, a creative as well as a critical mind. Statecraft has to be a creative effort to construct as well as to analyse and critique. And sometimes this is where academia does government a disservice. The balance between the creative impulse in study, the desire to create, be visionary, articulate how something should work, say the United Nations or an organisation like NATO, versus the capacity for critique has got imbalanced. And it's got imbalanced by government, by the provision, in academia, by the profusion of things like critical studies as well. Statecraft requires the creative impulse, crucially. Fifth, on the back of this, a generally liberal mind. I sometimes think in government that everything is true and nothing is true simultaneously. And when you sit around a table of people in government, it is rarely that someone does not have a point. And the job of good statecraft is to synthesize those different observations. There is no single form of truth, and we must be ecumenical in the tools of analysis. Don't approach something as a high political historian and taking those models into government, or a Marxist alone, or a Burkean, or whatever it is. If you approach those questions narrowly, you will miss the way that others think about those challenges and problems. So always remain ecumenical and genuinely liberal in your mind. 6, I told you I'd make it, Ulf. An appreciation of the spiritual over the hyper-rational. I've talked about objective realities. Governments are obsessed with metrics. Political science, I think, has slipped too far in government, not helped by an over-reliance on constant polling. So these objective realities must be respected and understood, but they must also involve imponderables like mood and tone and zeitgeist and language. And Ludwig von Rocker, the creator of Realpolitik in the 19th century, noted that the art of politics in the democratic age was to distinguish between momentary fashions and impulses and intellectual fashions and settled and received wisdom. And the power of the zeitgeist, he argued, was the single most defining force in politics. I think that is true of anything today. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you President Zelensky, for an example. 7, avoid the traps of presentism. I have my mind on the next panel. Statecraft should also always be based on a sense of perspective. We always hear, and we have heard in every age, technology will change everything. I can't think of an age in which hasn't that anxiety about technology been there. Or the current obsessions. We have lost the global middle ground with us over Ukraine. When was the global middle ground ever with the Western Alliance during the Cold War? What standards are we here? Another one, the authoritarians do grand strategy better than us silly democracies. Look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I ask you to pause on that. Or the authoritarians will get out of COVID faster and give us all a headache and provide a model versus a democracy. So avoid that presentism, because presentism will give you crippling angst. 8, the components of statecraft must, and this is where we begin to look forward in my final few remarks, must begin to expand to include new domains. Economics, technology, and science are essential to the affairs of state in the way they haven't been for the last 3 decades or beyond. More than at any point, I think, since the Second World War, trade is also an essential tool of statecraft, and this applies to areas like science and technology, and statecraft is changing in many other ways. Different types of dilemmas, therefore, emerge for large regulatory blocs who want to set terms and conditions, who yearn for self-sufficiency, and medium and small-sized powers who must prioritize agility and speed of action. And in my final 2 remarks, this is where I think statecraft needs to go next. 9, statecraft needs grand strategy. And grand strategy is hard, but a statecraft that simply refines, adapts, and responds to objective realities is not enough. Grand strategy is a higher or the highest form of statecraft, to quote Hal Brands. It brings together these different component parts, history, strategy, warfare, international relations, diplomacy, with the newer arts of statecraft, economics, technology, research, and science, and it tries to combine them with national purpose. Grand strategy is very hard, but grand strategy is an absolute necessity, and we must relearn the art. And then finally, number 10, statecraft needs to rediscover the art of planning once more. This is hard, and I've experienced it in a government that's used to being dependent on an open international economic system that suits it, but planning is something that liberal democracies and free market economies feel somewhat uncomfortable about historically, but it is a necessary precondition to respond to the competition we faced. It is not the same as grandiose projects to remake the world, but being passive respondents and adapters to the planning of others, which is well underway, by the way, is not good statecraft. And we've done this before. We did this very effectively in the 40s and 50s, but the concern and the anxiety about this is as old as ever. I give you one quote on which I will end. Francis Bacon, a scientist, philosopher, advisor to Elisabeth I, said this, and I think these words stick with me. "This is true," he bemoaned, "that the wisdom of all these latter times in princes' affairs is rather fine deliveries and shifting of dangers and mischiefs when they are near, rather than what Bacon wanted, solid and grounded courses to keep them aloof." So our plans need not be the best laid plans. They may get cracked and they may sometimes even get scrambled, but we must learn again to try and lay the egg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Can you give us a bright, shining example when many of these 10 components were at play?
I can give you an example of different components being at play. Number 6, I want to pick out an appreciation of the spiritual over the hyper-rational. Many of the metrics and assessments we had on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine suggested that Russia would likely run over the Ukrainian army extremely swiftly, that its air dominance would allow it to sort of collapse the Ukrainian self-defense forces within 2 weeks by some assessments. The imponderable, and the thing that I don't think Putin fully calculated, but was something that was shaped in the moment, but was hard to decipher and hard to capture, was that Ukrainian sense of national purpose, national defense, and unity under great stress and pressure. And that was such a powerful force, Ukraine's ability to fight and resist, and the story and the way the narrative emerged on the back of it was something that was not in the metrics, not in the objective realities, but I think the single most defining factor in Ukraine's response and the broader Western response to it.